About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be. Life with no distractions, we'll get away. This is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go, let's be free with me. Be free. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good evening and welcome to our latest live stream for GCSE Sociology. I'm joined as ever by Vicky. Hi Vicky.
Hi.
Hi. No Sarah this evening, so you've got me for some of the activities this evening. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this evening's session, Vicky?
So we are looking at poverty as a social issue this week. So we're looking at the Marxist view, we'll be having a look at the new right view. We're going to be looking at things like material deprivation. We're also going to have a look at how the government has tried to alleviate poverty. We're going to think about some studies. So we're going to think about Pete Townsend's Poverty in the UK study. And we're also going to think about Charles Murray's work on losing ground and his ideas about the underclass. So hopefully it'll be a good session. We've got plenty of stuff packed in and lots of activities as usual.
Absolutely, yeah, very good. So just a quick reminder, if you're watching us live, you can join in with the activities in the live chat window, and please do. If you're watching on catch up, as we know lots of you do every week, obviously you can't join in the live chat, but you can perhaps pause the video during some of the activities, give yourself a bit longer to answer them. Shall we get cracking straight away?
Absolutely, yes, sounds
we're
good.
over to an activity from you, Vicky, altered vowels.
Altered vowels. Yeah. Excellent. So hopefully you've all seen altered vowels before. So you will have a number of key phrases that pop up on the screen, and you just need to try and work out what the phrase is. So every vowel has been changed to an alternative. So they'll be up on the screen for a few moments, and you just need to pop your guesses into the chat window. And they are all to do with poverty as a social issue. Okay, so our first one is up on the screen. What do we think this one might be? So remember, all the vowels have been changed. So we'll give you a few moments, pop your answers into the chat. Okay. So just to see if we've got any of you who are brave enough to contribute for the first time this evening. What do we think it might be? Hopefully the cue is fairly easy. Well done. We've almost got the correct answer coming up on the boards. Not quite. You've got a little bit too many letters in there. So it's the opposite of what you have popped up onto the chat window. So if we can have the correct answer, please, Duncan. Excellent. Well done. You have got it correct. It is equality. Okay, perfect. Right, Duncan, can we have the next one, please? Excellent. So let's have a think about this one.
I think you should try and pronounce.
I was just thinking that one. I'm a bit, I'm a bit worried about the second word there, Duncan. Actually pronouncing that one.
Yeah, that's why I asked. I'm being mischievous.
I know. Well done. So we have got the correct answer coming through already into the chat window. That's helped me out of a hole there. So it is absolute poverty. Thank you very much. So we're going to have a bit of a think about what this is a bit later on in this session. Well done. Okay, let's have the next one up. So link to, these are obviously all linked to poverty as a social issue. So what do we think this one might be? So we've got a couple of good people answering so far and getting these answers correct. Let's have a think. What do we think this one might be? Well done. The correct answer is already coming up in the chat. It is material deprivation. Again, we'll talk about this a bit later on in this session. Okay, let's have the next one up, please. Right, what do we think this one might be? Okay. Again, maybe a little bit easier. And hopefully you recognise that last word. Well done. The correct answer is already coming through. It is relative poverty. Excellent. Super. Let's have the last one up, please. Excellent. Right, let's have a look at this one. What do we think this one might be? And again, we'll talk about all of these a bit later. Okay, let's have a look. I think it's a slightly more difficult one. Excellent. It is cultural deprivation. Super. Okay, well done, guys. Some good answers coming through there. Excellent work. So I'm going to hand over to Duncan now, and we're going to do a quick 60-second challenge. Duncan, are you ready for this one?
I was muted, so
I did wonder whether you were.
I was talking away very professionally to myself. Okay, so good luck with this, guys. We've got a 60-second challenge coming up here. So what we have here is we have a list of key terms down the left-hand side, and we've got some brief definitions on the right-hand side. And the idea is to, as some people are already starting to do in the live chat window, put a letter and a number together. So, for example, if you thought definition 1 was equality, you would put a 1, although you would not necessarily be correct in doing so. Okay, I'm going to start the countdown and let's see how you get on. See if you can put some of those key terms next to their correct definition. Okay, good luck. Very dramatic music for this one.
It is very dramatic.
Okay, well done. Now some answers coming through. I think these are quite tricky because a lot of these are quite similar concepts, aren't they? And so differentiating between deprivation and material deprivation, for example, or the different types of poverty is quite tricky, but then it's also really important because then you can use those terms accurately. So shall we have a look at the right answer? We'll solve the grid and have a look at that. I've seen some correct answers coming through, some that were pretty close. So we've got A5, so fairness in society, equality, equal opportunities might be one example of that. Life chances, opportunities people have to enjoy the good things in life. Deprivation, to go without things. Absolute poverty, where your basic needs are not met. Relative poverty, without things that we expect in the UK or in the particular society in which we're in. Material deprivation, being without the actual goods, particular things, maybe not having your own bedroom, that sort of thing. Material things, tangible things, as opposed to cultural deprivation, which is quite a controversial concept. But it's the absence of kind of life experiences and things that that it is suggested that we need to have, rather than, stuff. Okay, well done. So we're going to have a look now at what we're going to cover in this session. So what do we need to know about poverty as a social issue? Well, you need to know about the different interpretations of poverty from different perspectives. So, for example, a Marxist view, the idea of a culture of poverty, which is more of a new right idea, concept of material deprivation, government policies, so various ways that governments have tried to alleviate poverty and alleviate unemployment. Going to look at the concept of relative deprivation, and to do that we're going to look at the work of Townsend, and we're going to look at the concept of an underclass, and to do that we'll be looking at the work of Murray. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to have a look at the Marxist view of poverty to begin with. So we think about Victorian Britain, going back a little bit before our times. The working classes were really very, very poor. So a really good example of this is at the start of the Boer War in 1899. There was about 90% of British Army volunteers were deemed unfit for military service. So the government at the time became really concerned about the living standards and the bad health of people in Britain in general. It wasn't really concerned about the health of the workers. Instead, it was worried that Britain wouldn't be able to maintain its level of power or wealth if the workers, the proletariat, for example, weren't fit enough to turn up to work every day. So Marxists believe that this is why the government started to try to improve living conditions in the early 20th century. So when we think about how this kind of went around, we have lots of social campaigners at the time that were trying to make Britain better, particularly for the poor. And Joseph Rowntree is a really famous one of these. He was a social campaigner. And he showed the government that being poor was not the fault of the poor, which is what the government previously believed. And actually, there is still an element of that belief by some people today. And in 1906, the Liberal Party, who were in power at the time, started to take responsibility for the poor by starting the welfare state, which included free school meals, pensions and benefits. But again, the Marxist view of this would be that it wasn't really done to help the poor. It was done more to make sure that there was no impact on the economy. Can we have the next slide up, please, Duncan? Thank you very much. So if we think about the New Right view then, so New Right sociologist Charles Murray, we're probably all familiar with his work. He talked about how the poor had this culture of poverty. So that idea that actually the poor were partly responsible for the sort of the poverty they found themselves in. And he said that the poor have their own way of life. He said he believed that it didn't have quite the same values as the rest of society. For example, they didn't really value hard work. And he believed that many poor people simply chose not to work as a life on benefits was the easier option. He also said that the poor subcultures are often linked to crime and delinquency, where criminal behaviour is seen as normal. So you might have come across this in stratification, but also in crime and deviance as well. And he linked this to the breakdown of relationships. He talked about many boys in particular being brought up without a decent role model to show the importance of family responsibility. Therefore, these boys often got involved in antisocial behaviour and eventually crime, and this would indeed harm their future job prospects and make them end up in poverty. So we will talk about Charles Murray's work in one of his studies in a bit more detail later on in this session. Can I have the next slide up? Perfect. So I'm going to talk about material deprivation now. That's a term that came up in both the altered vows, and the 60-second challenge. So it's the inability to afford the basic resources that you would expect to have in your country. So people living with material deprivation, for example, might live in really damp, cramped conditions. They might not be able to afford a decent, balanced diet. They might not be able to heat their homes properly. And this has been in the news a lot in the last couple of weeks as we've heard about the government, energy companies and their plans to increase prices further. And material deprivation can have a big impact upon your health. So, for example, if you're living in damp, cramped conditions, you can suffer from all sorts of things like respiratory illnesses. If you're unable to heat your home, you can lead to pneumonia. A poor diet could lead to all sorts of health complications. And it can also affect a pupil's educational achievement. Remember, lots of these themes, they sort of crop up again and again across different units that we've studied. So things like pupils might be able to afford sufficient food, heating, clothing or educational resources, which might have a real impact on their educational performance, and it could lead to underachievement. So real material deprivation is a huge part of poverty being as a social issue. So Duncan's going to talk to you now about how the government has tried to alleviate poverty over the years.
Okay, so over the years, governments have increased spending on welfare benefits, although occasionally governments do the opposite, depending on the sort of perspective of the government at the time. But there have been since that early time that Vicky mentioned, 1906, been other periods, particularly after the Second World War, 1945, where big increases in what became known as the welfare state, welfare payments for families with children, for pensioners, income support, working tax credits. More recently, that was replaced by something called universal credit. There was a top-up of that during the pandemic, and there was some debate about whether that top-up ought to remain, that increase in the payment, but Parliament voted against doing so. There have been policies such as funding nursery places to help parents return to work and encourage parents to go to work. If we think about education more generally, things like free school meals, the pupil premium funding are government policies that help to alleviate poverty. Also, there was special catch-up fund during the pandemic to assist with remote learning. So, for example, to help pay towards tutors or to provide people with laptops or other devices. Again, lots of debates about how effective this has been and whether the resources reach the right people, etc. There was also a big debate, and you'll remember this, I'm sure, because it involved like Marcus Rashford and people like that, about free school meals during lockdown and how people who would ordinarily get free school meals could still access free lunches during that time, and also about during the holidays and things, not just to do with COVID and the pandemic, but obviously if people were depending on a free meal during term time, it's quite likely that they may require one during school holidays as well. There were brought in after 1997 something called Sure Start Centres, which later were known as children's centres, that were set up to help new mothers, new parents, new families, and early childhood. A lot of those have been shut down since 2010, although some still exist, perhaps in slightly different forms. And there are a range of policies for local areas, New Deal for communities, local enterprise partnerships to try and boost economic growth, and in doing so, therefore try and create more jobs. And certainly from unemployment is a big driver of poverty, so increasing employment certainly helps. And from that kind of new right perspective, employment is very much the route out of poverty. Okay. I'm going to hand back to Vicky for the 30-second challenge.
Perfect, thank you very much. So we've got a 60-second challenge to do. We've got a couple more a bit later that Duncan's going to do, but we're going to do this first one. So I said 60 second, it's 30 second even. we want to think about what is the impact of poverty in the UK on children. So we're going to put 30 seconds on the clock. You just need to pop some answers into the chat window. So what is the impact of poverty in the UK on children? If we can have the clock, thank you very much. Super. That always goes super quick. So if you're watching on catch up, pause it now, and then you can give yourself a little bit more time to come up with some answers. So we've got some interesting things coming through. Can we have the answer revealed, please, Duncan? Super. So we've got poor living conditions, poor diet and health, may have to go to work as well as school, less chance of achieving good exam results, vulnerable to crime. So some really interesting things here. So lots of these children are going to live in really poor housing that's going to be overcrowded. They might have to share a room, for example, with one or more siblings. They might then not have a quiet place to study, which might be really difficult to get that good night's sleep. Like we already said, the house might be cold and damp, resulting in those ill health conditions like respiratory illnesses. That might mean that that might be made worse by a poor diet. If you don't get a good diet, it's really hard to get enough sleep. It's really hard to concentrate at school. So therefore, all these things are linked together. We also need to consider that these children who live in poverty might not be able to afford those revision materials or ICT access. They might have to support the household with a part-time job. They might have less time to study, which will make the issue even worse. And these link to those material factors that I was just talking about a minute ago. And obviously you've covered those in the education unit. And again, it links to crime here. So some young people might feel such pressure to have nice things to help to put food on the table that they become vulnerable to criminals, and they might be recruited into gangs, county lines, all sorts of things. Again, showing all of those different links that you get across the different topics in sociology. Right, I'm going to hand back to Duncan now to talk to you about an important study.
Okay, so this is, we just had another good point in the chat window there about people getting more distracted because they haven't got a quiet place to study at home. Absolutely. Again, making that education link. One of your key studies that you look at in GCSE is Pete Townend's Poverty in the United Kingdom. And it's a very interesting study in a lot of ways. So he used questionnaires to develop a new way to measure poverty in the UK, because he felt that the kind of official measures were not providing an accurate picture. By the official measures, it was really those measures that determined who received state benefits. So he created an index that measured relative deprivation. To do this, he tried to see whether he could come up with essentially what most people had and what would be considered to be, normal lifestyle, and then try to see how people who fell short of that by using these questionnaires. And what he found when looking at things like food, clothes, fuel, access to leisure activities was that a lot more people were living in poverty than the official measures would suggest. However, there are quite a lot of criticisms of the questionnaire, because of course just because people don't buy something doesn't necessarily mean that they can't. So the example that people often point to is that one of his measures of poverty was if people weren't buying meat regularly. Now obviously that might be that people can't afford meat because it's quite expensive, but it could equally be that people are choosing not to buy meat and buying other food, particularly perhaps if they're vegetarian or vegan, for example. So there are certainly problems with the study, but it does provide an interesting insight into the idea that we probably underestimate the scale of poverty when we look at it in that sort of relative way. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Vicky to talk a bit about Charles Murray.
Perfect, thank you very much. So Charles Murray, we've already mentioned him, a new right sociologist, got quite a lot of traditional views. So he wrote a study called Losing Ground, which was looking at American society and how it had developed a growing underclass. So he uses the term, he talked about how the government policies had basically encouraged members of this underclass, as he called them, to become dependent on benefits. So he said, in his view, American welfare reforms, so that kind of the idea of the welfare state there, it resulted in an increased level of benefit. And he said that this discouraged people to kind of look after themselves and become self-sufficient. And it led to a growing number of single parents, and it made young people lose interest in getting jobs. And he talked about this underclass that's growing and growing, which he claimed would pose a big threat to the economic and social fabric of American society, because these members of the underclass then became a burden on taxpayers, and he said they were also responsible for a rising crime rate. So this was done in America. Now, he then visited Britain at the end of the 1980s, so we're looking, not a really long time ago, but still, we're looking a few decades ago now, after the publication of his study. And he argued that when he came to Britain, he could also see this development of this underclass. And he talked about this idea of rising rates of illegitimacy, so, children being born outside of marriage, for example, a rising crime rate. And he also argued that there was an apparent unwillingness amongst some of Britain's youth to seek employment. And he said that this was a sign of the development of the underclass, these people that didn't actually really want to work. And he talked about the values of honesty, family life, and hard work being kind of undermined by these people who didn't value them at all. And they replaced these values with alternative values, which tolerated things like crime and antisocial behaviour and all sorts of things. So when he talks about the underclass, we're kind of really talking about the idea this benefit system doesn't really affect them. He talks about the underclass having really unconventional attitudes. They don't really want stable relationships, they want paid employment. However, lots of people say that's actually not the case. Lots and lots of evidence suggests that people who are claiming benefits do actually want to work. They do have conventional attitudes, they want that stable relationship. And sometimes, we need to, not sometimes, we actually need to view these members of the underclass, as he would call them, as victims of social inequality and not the cause of social problems, as Charles Murray would argue. Now, again, we know that he's a new right sociologist, so they do have really traditional views. So the new right have lots of theories that blame the benefit system for producing groups who are unable or unwilling to earn their own living. And that's obviously really bad for society in terms of it creates a really horrible stereotypical view of people living in poverty. This is reinforced by lots of TV shows like Shameless and Benefit Streets that show people, show these stereotypes, which are not particularly true. So I'm going to hand over to Duncan for a 30-second challenge based on the two studies we have just talked about.
Okay, so this is really relating to what you've been just been hearing, or what I told you about Pete Townsend and what Vicky's told you about Murray. So if you could have a look now at, for 30 seconds, what did Pete Townsend include in his relative deprivation index in poverty in the UK? So how did, what sorts of things were included in that? As before, 30 seconds does go very quickly. I think probably some of you might still be typing a few ideas, but a few things coming through. Again, if you're watching on catch up, you can always pause it and give yourself a little more time, but we shall have a look. So we have got the defined relative deprivation as a lack of resources to obtain the standard of living that was widely available in society. What did this include? Things like decent housing, good diet, clothes, fuel, access to leisure facilities. But, as we mentioned, the index was criticised, for example, the point about eating meat that we mentioned before. If we look at Charles Murray now, and his why did Charles Murray argue that there was an underclass developing in the UK? So again, you've got 30 seconds to think about this. Why did Charles Murray think that there was an underclass developing in the UK in the 1980s? Okay, got a good answer coming from Fatima. The underclass were depending on benefits which increased in lone parent families. Yeah, so absolutely. So I'm sure some other answers coming through, but we'll have a look there. So yes, you're absolutely right, Fatima. So Charles Murray was critical about the availability of benefits, felt that there were people who had little interest in getting a job because they could get money from the state, suggesting that they were a burden on taxpayers. He linked this, as you say, to a decline of the nuclear family, an increase in single parents, and because he had quite a traditional view of the roles of people in the family, he was sort of imagining, therefore, that people wouldn't unlikely to be working and therefore more reliant on the state, and also concerns about the absent father and what impact that would particularly have on boys, that there might be lack a positive male role model. Okay, as you'd expect, there are lots of criticisms of this study, which I'm sure you can have a read about, but that is the basis of what he said. Fatima also, lack of role models for young boys could lead to an increase in crime. Absolutely, well done. So some really good answers come in there in the chat window, which is great to see. Well done. Okay, and also this one's me as well. We're going to have a little look at some evaluation now. Now, just a quick reminder that when we evaluate in sociology, it doesn't always have to be a criticism, although it might be. So we make an argument to evaluate it. We're really sort of making a judgment on it. So it might be that we criticise it. It might be that we find some way to support it, find a strength in it. It might be that we look for an alternative to it, consider to what extent it's true, so think about a limitation. Or we might try and provide some evidence. And of course, when providing evidence, that might be evidence to support it, or sometimes also evidence to criticise or contradict it. So we've got a statement here relating to the study we've just been talking about. New right sociologist Charles Murray claims that the poor are poor because of their culture. Okay, we're going to spin the wheel to see what sort of evaluation we want to look for here. Okay, can you provide any evidence that would support or undermine this point that the poor are poor because of their culture? And one way to think about it is, how does Charles Murray explain it? What does he mean by this? How would he explain this point? That might be one way to look at it, but you might take a different approach. What is it about the poor's culture, according to Charles Murray, that keeps them poor? Can we think of any examples, some evidence? What sort of evidence could there be, other than Murray's research evidence, which is fine as well? You could tell us about that. Just give you a moment or two. Again, if you're watching on catch up, you could pause the video, spend a bit more time thinking about this. So official statistics could be used as evidence. They could, Fatima. Yeah, you could look at, obviously, culture isn't something that's necessarily statistical, but if you picked up on particular aspects of what Murray talked about, for example, the poverty among lone parent families, you could find some statistical evidence to show correlations between poverty and family form, for example. So, I mean, the idea, what Murray argued was that, and so this is kind of his evidence because it was his research. He said it showed that people in poverty were socialised into values that kept them into poverty. That included dependency on the welfare state, lacking the incentive to work, that sometimes home life might be chaotic, single parents struggling to bring up children alone, lacking a second parent means that children could get involved in antisocial behaviour, and that might harm their prospects, and then they could get kind of trapped into a sort of cycle of poverty. Absolutely. But you're quite right, Fatima. You could look at statistical evidence and other forms of evidence to try and either support this or indeed contradict it, because in fact statistics show if you take kind of poverty out of the equation, which is rather what causes the poverty, what causes the antisocial behaviour, is it poverty or family form or culture? There's no evidence to show that people from a lone parent background commit more crimes than people from any other family form. So you can find some evidence to criticise Murray there. We've also got from Fatima, people in poverty are more likely to be socialised into criminal behaviour due to the lack of education and role models. Yeah, absolutely. So that's what Murray argued. Well done. Very good. Let's spin the wheel again. Okay. It might be that we've already given away some of the answers to this one, depending on where the wheel lands. Yeah, can we think of a criticism of this point? So we may have already come up with the odd one. But, you may come up with other criticisms from the ones we've already mentioned. Why might this not be true? The idea that the poor are poor because of their culture. It's something that people sometimes describe as kind of victim blaming. So one way to sort of substantiate criticism would be to consider alternatives, wouldn't it? You could think about what other sociologists say, how other sociologists explain poverty. For example, feminists would say that women are more likely to experience poverty because of their domestic role, perhaps having to work part-time around their children. So they'd look at those single-parent families, for example, and see not being culture or people's personal choices causing the poverty, but the structural, patriarchy, the nature of our society causing it. And similarly with Marxism, they'd say it's capitalism causing the poverty. Working class people are being exploited by their greedy bosses. You could also look at people ending up feeling they need things that perhaps they don't through the power of advertising and media messages, and therefore not having enough money because they've spent it on things that they don't really need. So there's all sorts of possibilities you could come in there other than just blaming the poor people themselves for their poverty, saying that it was their culture that caused it. There are lots of other ways to consider that. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Vicky now and look at an exam question.
Super, thank you very much. So we're going to have a quick look at one exam question, and then we're going to link this to our final activity, which is stepping stones, that we'll do in a minute. So identify and explain one factor that can lead to an individual becoming dependent on the welfare system. Okay, Duncan, can we have a look at the next slide, which will get us to think about certain things? So there's a few ways we can think about here. Remember, it is one factor only. So we could either go down the route of below educational attainment, so that risk of low paid and insecure jobs. We could think about long-term unemployment, that idea of maybe de-skilling yourself, or the idea of having a disability or chronic illness, which might mean that you're seen as a risky employee due to potential time off. So let's have a look at some exam gold here to see what we could do with this answer. So like I've said, and we say this every week with these 4 marker questions, the examiner is going to want to see one argument developed fully. If you write about more than one, you will not get credit for any more. So pick that one key idea. So we might have a think about long-term unemployment in this case. So you can talk about that, having that significant period out of the labour market, which can lead you to become de-skilled. It can also make you lose your confidence. So you might have had a previous job where you were really confident, very skilled member of staff, but suddenly you've been out of the labour market for a while. You start to doubt your abilities. You feel that perhaps you don't deserve a job. You get, I think, something called imposter syndrome, where you think that you really shouldn't be there and don't have a right to be there. And obviously, all of these things can actually harm your future employment prospects. As well as that idea of you becoming skilled and losing your confidence, you might also have the assumption perhaps of being lazy and happy not to work if you've taken a big chunk of time out of the labour market. When I say taken, I mean like you spent a chunk of time, not necessarily through your own choice. So we're going to have a stepping stones activity to see how we could really develop a good chain of analysis to explain how someone can become dependent on the welfare system. So remember, these chains of analysis, we've talked about these a lot. So these are really important for your longer answer questions. So particularly, 4 markers, anything between a 4 and a 12 marker, we would expect to see these chains of analysis. Sometimes we call them a chain of reasoning. So let's have a look at our stepping stones, please, Duncan. Okay, so this time we're going to go down the route of the leaving school with few formal qualifications rather than being out of the labour market. So someone may leave school with few formal qualifications, so they are much more likely to claim benefits to pay their household bills. So we need to fill in the missing 2 stepping stones, because we've got number 1, number 4. Together they make a bit of a ropey answer, one that you probably wouldn't get a particularly good mark for in an exam. So what could we pop in between to make that great chain of analysis, to give us a really good quality analysis of this answer? So someone may leave school with few formal qualifications. Let's have a think about that. What could you write next? Have a think. So again, if you're watching on catch up, you can pause, give yourself a little bit more time. So somebody may leave school with few formal qualifications. What do you think that might lead to? What might be the next step? Duncan, can we have the stepping stone revealed? Oh, well done. We've got a really good answer coming through here. Lack of skills for job, not fit for job, so lack of income, relying on benefits. Some really good things there. So we've got kind of our 4 stepping stones. So well done, Fatima. Let's have a look and see if we can develop some of these. So, for example, this might make them much less attracted to employers who may think they are lazy or they lack ability. So if that's the case, what could be our next step? So Fatima's gone for lack of qualifications, lack of skills for job, not fit for the job, so a lack of income, so therefore rely on benefits. Let's see what we've got on stepping stone number 3. So this increases the risk of low paid or insecure employment. So well done, Fatima, really close to what you've written there. For example, you might have to have a 0 hours contract. So they are much more likely to have to claim benefits to pay their household bills. So what we're looking for with these chains of analysis are the idea of those connecting with, so they are, or this might lead to, therefore. There's lots of things that you can pop in there. Some really good answers coming through the chat window, particularly from you, Fatima. Excellent work today. So if you need any more help with your revision, particularly with mocks coming up, there's lots of stuff on our website. Lots of this, or all of the sessions that we have done over the previous weeks and actually last academic year are all available on the on-demand page. But we've got revision cards, all sorts of booklets and things for you to have a work through. Have a look at the Tutor2U website. Lots and lots of things there for that will help you with those mocks and those upcoming exams next time as well. We are going to have a break next week, but we will be back the following Monday after half term. I know it's half term for some of you this week, but half term for me selfishly next week. So we'll be back after that one on the 28th for our next session.
Yeah, great stuff. Well done, Vicky. Some really good contributions there, weren't there? Lots of really good stuff. We had Fatima, we had Olga, Yashiro. Quite a few. Sorry if I have missed anyone out. Lots of people giving really good responses there. Well done. So if you've enjoyed the session, you found it useful, can you put click thumbs up to say that you like it. If we get up to double figures, we can pay Vicky extra for the session. So,
Oh, perfect.
so yeah, get liking away if we get those likes up before we go off the broadcast. And yeah, we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time for looking more, still sticking with stratification for the time being.
Yeah, I think we've got power and authority or power relationships coming up, but I'm not sure. I'm off the top of my head, I can't remember what it is. I'm really sorry.
Yeah,
So
and we'll also
unprofessional.
it's all right. And we're going to be keeping a close eye on the advanced information that the exam board sent out, and make sure that we're factoring that into our planning for this as well. Okay,
Yeah.
so see you soon.
Yeah,
Bye,
well done,
everybody.
guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.